In this video, I want to talk about why autistic identity evolves after midlife and how it impacts long-term marriages. Now, there's a moment that quietly happens in many neurodiverse marriages after 20, sometimes 30, sometimes years later. And it confuses everyone. The autistic spouse suddenly seems different, more withdrawn, more sensitive, more rigid about routines, less willing to socialize, less able to push through, less emotionally available, and sometimes even less interested in maintaining the marriage exactly the way it has always functioned. And the neurotypical partner often says something heartbreaking. What happened to the person I married? But the autistic partner is often silently thinking something equally heartbreaking. I don't think I can survive pretending anymore. And that is the collision very few people are talking about. Because midlife often becomes the point where autistic masking finally breaks down. Not because the autistic person suddenly changes personalities, but because decades of adaptation become neurologically unsustainable. So today, we're going to be talking about why autistic identity often evolves dramatically after midlife, why long-term marriages suddenly hit a wall after years of appearing stable, and why what looks like abandonment may actually be a late-stage survival response. And if you're in a long-term neurodiverse marriage, this conversation may explain dynamics that neither of you have had language for before. Now, one of the greatest misconceptions about autism is the belief that autistic identity stays static throughout life. It does not. In fact, many autistic adults spend the first half of life building an identity that's heavily constructed around adaptation, especially undiagnosed autistic adults, especially high-masking autistic adults, especially autistic men and women who grew up in generations where autism was poorly understood. Many of these people learned very early, do what works, blend in, perform competence, suppress discomfort, stay functional, meet expectations, don't burden other people with your sensitivities. And for decades, that strategy may have appeared successful. They build careers, they raise children, they maintain marriages, they follow routines, they provide stability. But underneath that functioning, there's often a tremendous neurological cost accumulating over time. Because masking is not free. Masking consumes cognitive bandwidth, emotional energy, executive functioning, nervous system resources, and many autistic adults unknowingly spend decades operating in chronic survival mode. Chronic low-grade cortisol and adrenaline going through their system 24/7. Now let's talk about why midlife changes everything. Midlife changes the equation neurologically, emotionally, hormonally, relationally, and existentially. Children grow older, career stress accumulates, hormonal shifts occur, aging reduces cognitive flexibility and recovery capacity, and the nervous system becomes less resilient under chronic overload. And suddenly, the autistic person can no longer maintain the same level of performance masking they sustained for years. What once felt difficult now feels impossible. Social interaction becomes exhausting instead of manageable. Noise tolerance drops. Sensory overwhelm increases. Recovery takes longer. Conflict becomes harder to process. Emotional demands feel invasive rather than merely stressful. And many autistic adults begin realizing something profound. The version of myself everyone knows may not actually be sustainable. And this realization can become an identity earthquake. Because many autistic adults discover in midlife that they built an entire personality around survival adaptation. And once the nervous system can no longer maintain that adaptation, the individual begins asking, who am I underneath this mask? That question can radically reshape a marriage. Now let's talk about the neurotypical partner's experience. If you are the NT wife watching this can feel deeply destabilizing because the marital contract suddenly changes without warning. The routines change, the emotional availability changes, the tolerance for social activities changes, the willingness to participate changes, the flexibility changes, and for many neurotypical spouses, they feel emotionally abandoned. And why wouldn't they? Especially wives in long-term neurodiverse marriages. because they often spent years building relational systems around the version of their spouse that existed during heavy masking years. And suddenly that spouse begins saying things like, I can't do this anymore. I need more quiet. I need more recovery time. I can't keep socializing this way. I can't tolerate constant emotional processing. I need boundaries. I need space. I'm exhausted all the time. And to the neurotypical partner, that can feel like the marriage is disappearing. But what's often actually happening is the autistic spouse is attempting neurological survival. And that distinction matters enormously. Because if this gets misinterpreted purely as rejection, both partners become trapped in escalating pain. The neurotypical spouse feels unwanted. The autistic spouse feels chronically overwhelmed and misunderstood. And both people begin grieving different versions of the marriage simultaneously. Now let's talk about the burnout identity pivot. Burnout is not merely exhaustion for autistic adults. Burnout often dismantles old identity structures. The autistic individual may begin realizing that I never actually liked certain social expectations. I was enduring them. I was just toughing it out. I was not relaxed during family gatherings. I was performing. I was not emotionally regulated during constant relational processing. I was simply surviving. And this realization can create enormous confusion for both spouses, because the autistic partner often begins redefining authenticity later in life. They start prioritizing sensory boundaries, reduced stimulation, more solitude, more predictability, more recovery, less emotional intensity, less masking, less performance-based relating. But the neurotypical spouse may interpret these shifts through an attachment lens instead of a neurological lens, which means they may begin to think things like, you don't love me anymore, when the autistic partner may actually be trying to say, my nervous system is collapsing. Those are not the same thing. But inside marriages, they often become tragically confused. Now let's talk about why late diagnosis intensifies this. Late diagnosis often reorganizes an entire life narrative. Suddenly, decades of confusion begin making sense. The person realizes, I wasn't defective. I wasn't lazy. I wasn't emotionally cold. I wasn't a narcissist. I was neurologically overloaded. That realization can bring enormous relief. But it can also trigger anger, grief, regret, identity disorientation, and sometimes a powerful desire to reclaim authenticity before the later stages of life. Many autistic adults begin thinking, I don't want to spend the next 20 years performing a version of myself that is destroying me internally. And that realization may look radical to the neurotypical spouse, especially if the marriage depended heavily on old coping structures. Now let's talk about the hidden marital script. Many long-term neurodiverse marriages unknowingly develop what I call adaptive marital scripts. Each partner develops roles. The neurotypical spouse may become the emotional manager, the social organizer, the relational initiator. The autistic spouse may become the provider, the logical stabilizer, the routine maintainer, the compartmentalizer. And these scripts may function for decades until burnout disrupts them. Then suddenly, the autistic spouse no longer has the bandwidth to maintain the previous role structure. And the neurotypical spouse often feels terrified because the entire relational ecosystem destabilizes. And this is why couples sometimes say, we were fine for 20 years and then suddenly everything fell apart. Usually it didn't suddenly fall apart. Usually the nervous system finally stopped compensating. Now, let's talk about reframing the crisis. This does not mean neurotypical partners should simply suppress their pain. No, their grief is real. Their loneliness is real. Their confusion is real. Many neurotypical spouses spent years believing they understood the rules of the relationship, only to discover the foundation was built partly on masking. That is profoundly destabilizing. But what helps couples survive this stage is reframing the crisis. The question shifts from, why are you abandoning me? To, what is your nervous system trying to survive right now? That shift changes everything because it opens the possibility of collaborative adaptation rather than mutual accusation. Now, let's talk about what healthy midlife adaptation looks like. Healthy adaptation usually requires both partners to evolve. The autistic partner must learn to communicate needs without disappearing emotionally. That part matters. Authenticity can't become emotional exile. But the neurotypical partner often must also stop measuring love exclusively through old performance behaviors, because many autistic adults genuinely love deeply while no longer being neurologically capable of constant relational output. And couples who survive this transition often create an entirely new marital structure, one with more direct communication, more realistic sensory expectations, more recovery space, more emotional clarity, less performance, less pretending, less shame. And ironically, some marriages become more emotionally honest after the collapse of masking. Not necessarily easier, but more real. Now, let's talk about the fear no one says out loud. Underneath all of this, there is often a fear both partners carry silently. The neurotypical spouse fears, well, if the mask disappears, maybe there won't be enough relationship left. And the autistic spouse fears, well, if I stop masking, nobody will stay. Those fears create enormous tension because both individuals are asking the same core question. Can I still be loved if I stop surviving and start existing more honestly? That is the deeper midlife crisis many neurodiverse couples are actually facing. Not merely communication problems, no, but identity transformation. Now, if you're living through this right now, I want you to understand something very important. This stage does not automatically mean your marriage is doomed, but it does mean the old version of the marriage may no longer be sustainable. And that can feel terrifying because both people are grieving. The neurotypical spouse may be grieving the relationship structure they depended on, and the autistic spouse may be grieving decades spent disconnected from their authentic nervous system needs. But grief is not evidence that love has disappeared. Sometimes grief is evidence that a relationship is being forced to evolve. And the couples who navigate this successfully usually stop fighting reality long enough to become curious about each other again. Not the masked version, not the survival version, no, but the exhausted, aging, honest human beings underneath all of it. And sometimes that is where real marriage finally begins. Now, if this video resonated with you, subscribe to the channel. And if you're navigating a long-term neurodiverse marriage affected by burnout, masking collapse, or late diagnosis, leave a comment. A lot more couples are living through this than people realize. You're not the only ones trying to figure this out. I'll see you in the next video. Would you like to schedule a paid private coaching session? This will be in the form of a face-to-face Zoom call. Underneath any of my videos, you'll see this Calendly link. If you click on that link, it'll open up my calendar. You can pick the available days and times that works for your schedule. You'll get a follow-up email immediately after purchasing a session that will have the Zoom link that coincides with the day and time that you picked. I will get an email too that you scheduled a session, and I will be available on that exact day and time, and we will talk. I look forward to working with you. Hey guys, this is Mark. Some of you may not know that I have a lot of books on Amazon. So if you like my videos, you'll like my books. I have several for ASD spouses, for NT spouses, and for the neurodiverse couple. Underneath any of my videos, you'll see this link. Feel free to click on that link and see what's available. I'm sure you'll find something that applies to you. So if you're struggling in your neurodiverse marriage, help is available, one click away.